What if I told you that every time someone says Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, they're actually hurling an insult at him? That the name we all know the Dark Lord by is essentially a derogatory nickname his enemies gave him, and that his real name means something completely different. In this video, I'm going to cover some topics that might seem obvious to those who've read the books, but could be pretty eye-opening for those who've only watched the movies. When it comes to the Dark Lord himself, there's so much more to his story than what we see on screen, from his true identity to the many faces he wore to deceive Middle-earth. I hope at least one of these facts is helpful or new to you. Let's dive in. Number 1. Sauron is actually an insult. His true name was Myron, the Admirable. Here's something that will completely change how you watch these films. Every single time someone says Sauron, they're essentially calling him the Abhorred One, or the Hated One. It's not his real name. It's the Elvish equivalent of calling someone the Disgusting or the Detestable. Imagine if instead of calling Voldemort by his chosen name, everyone in Harry Potter just called him the Repulsive Guy. That's essentially what's happening every time someone says Sauron. So what was his real name? Before his fall into darkness, this powerful spirit was known as Myron, which in the ancient Elvish tongue of Quenya means the Admirable or the Excellent One. The contrast couldn't be more stark, from the admirable to the abhorred. Myron was a Maya, one of the divine angelic spirits created before the world itself existed, and he served Ole the Smith, one of the greatest of the Valar, the godlike beings who shaped Middle-earth. Under Ole's guidance, Myron became extraordinarily skilled in craftsmanship and the art of creation. His greatest virtue was his love of order, perfection, and his dislike of anything wasteful or chaotic. He was, by all accounts, admirable, hence the name. It was only after he joined Morgoth, the first Dark Lord and the most powerful evil being in all of Tolkien's legendarium, that everything changed. The elves, recognizing his betrayal and the evil he had become, stopped calling him by his true name and instead gave him a new one, Sauron. In the Sindarin Elvish language, this means the abhorred, the abominable, or the hated one. Now, to be clear, the elves didn't invent the name as an insult. They used it because his nature had become abominable. It became insulting because it accurately described what he had become. It was a name of contempt, of utter rejection, but also of truth. And here's what makes this even more interesting. Sauron hated this name. According to Tolkien's writings, he continued to call himself Myron, or Tar Myron, meaning King Excellent, throughout the First and Second Ages, refusing to accept the derogatory name his foes had given him. When he appeared in disguise as Anatar in the Second Age, he was trying to reclaim some of that old identity, presenting himself once again as admirable and worthy of trust. But the name stuck. Even his own servants came to use it, and by the Third Age, the time of the Lord of the Rings, the name Sauron had become so thoroughly associated with evil that his original name, Myron, was largely forgotten by most of Middle-earth. The admirable craftsman who once served the Valar had been completely consumed by what he had become. Think about that the next time you hear someone in the films say Sauron. They're not using his name, they're throwing an ancient insult at him, one that has endured for thousands of years, and has come to define him more than his true identity ever did. The being who was once the Admirable became so thoroughly evil that he's now known only as the Abhorred. That's the true tragedy and the true horror of Sauron's fall. Number 2. Sauron and Gandalf are the same type of being. This is probably one of the most shocking revelations for those who've only watched Peter Jackson's films. When you see the towering armoured figure of Sauron in the prologue, wielding his massive mace and dispatching armies, and then you see the kindly old wizard Gandalf enjoying his pipeweed in the Shire, you'd never guess they were actually the same kind of creature. But they are. Both Sauron and Gandalf are Maiar, immortal angelic spirits that existed before the creation of the world. They're part of the same divine race that helped shape Middle-earth in its earliest days. To put it in Tolkien's own words from his letters, they are the near equivalent in the mode of these tales of angels. Now, before you ask why Gandalf couldn't just smite Sauron if they're the same type of being, here's where it gets interesting. Not all Maiar are created equal. Just as not all humans have the same strength or abilities, The Maiar vary enormously in their power and specializations. Sauron was, from the beginning, one of the mightiest of all the Maiar. He's described as the greatest of Morgoth's servants, possessing power that far exceeded most others of his kind. Gandalf, on the other hand, while wise and powerful in his own right, was never described as the strongest Maiar. In fact, when he was first chosen to go to Middle-earth, he was reluctant, saying, "I am too weak for such a task, and I fear Sauron." The chief of the Valar, Manwë, replied that this was precisely why he should go, because that fear would keep him humble and true to his mission. But here's another crucial difference. When Gandalf and the other wizards were sent to Middle-earth in the Third Age, they were deliberately limited. They were placed in the bodies of old men and forbidden from matching Sauron's power directly or ruling over the peoples of Middle-earth. Their job was to inspire and guide, not to dominate. Sauron, by contrast, had no such restrictions. He poured all his might into conquering and dominating, even transferring much of his power into the One Ring to amplify his strength further. So yes, they're the same type of being, but Sauron was both naturally more powerful and willing to use every ounce of his strength for domination, while Gandalf worked within strict limitations. It's like comparing a professional bodybuilder going all out to an athlete who's been told they can only use one hand and must work through encouragement rather than force. Number 3. The Eye of Sauron had a physical body attached to it. This is perhaps the biggest misconception created by the movies. Peter Jackson's films show us Sauron as a great, lidless eye of flame sitting atop Barad-dûr, a disembodied force of evil that can't take physical form because he lost the ring. It's a striking visual that has become iconic, but it's not what Tolkien actually wrote. In the books, Sauron absolutely had a physical body during the events of The Lord of the Rings. The Eye of Sauron that's mentioned repeatedly is not his literal form. It's a metaphor for his will, his piercing perception, his all-seeing malice. When characters refer to the Eye, they're talking about his mind reaching out across Middle-earth, searching for the ring, much like we might say someone has eyes everywhere, without meaning they literally have eyeballs scattered around. Interestingly, the red eye was actually an emblem that Sauron himself chose. His orcs bore the symbol of the eye on their helmets and shields, and he forbade his name to be spoken or written, insisting his servants refer to him as the Eye instead. So the eye was real as a symbol of his power and surveillance, but it wasn't his actual physical form. It was his chosen representation of his all-seeing will. The evidence for Sauron's physical form is scattered throughout the text. Gollum, who was captured and tortured in Barad-dûr, mentions that Sauron has only 4 fingers on his black hand, because he never regrew the finger that Isildur cut off. You can't cut off a finger from a giant floating eyeball. The orcs and servants in Mordor speak of Sauron coming forth and worry about bringing prisoners before him physically. At the Black Gate, the hero's plan specifically includes drawing Sauron's attention so he might come out to battle, which would make little sense if he was just an immobile eye on a tower. In one of his letters, Tolkien explicitly described Sauron's physical form during this period. The form that he took was that of a man of more than human stature, but not gigantic. He goes on to describe him as an image of malice and hatred made visible, a tall, terrible humanoid figure that radiated such intense heat that Gil-galad the Elf King was burned to death just by his touch. So why didn't Sauron come out to fight in the War of the Ring? Because he was afraid. After his defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance, where he lost the ring and was reduced to a shadow for 1,000 years, he had become cautious. He chose to remain in his fortress, using his vast armies instead, confident that no force could penetrate Mordor and destroy the ring. His physical body existed, but he kept it safely hidden away. The eye was his symbol, his emblem, and a description of his all-perceiving will, not his actual form. Number 4. Sauron was a master shapeshifter who took many terrifying forms. When you think of Sauron from the movies, you probably picture that terrifying armored warrior from the opening of Fellowship, or perhaps the Flaming Eye. What you definitely don't picture is a giant wolf tearing through elven warriors, or a monstrous serpent, or a vampire dripping with blood, or a beautiful, charming emissary of the gods. But Sauron was all of these things and more, and his ability to change his form was one of his most dangerous weapons, one that the films barely hint at. The shapeshifter of the First Age. During the First Age, Sauron had complete mastery over his form and could shift into various terrifying shapes at will. These weren't illusions or tricks of the light. These were actual physical transformations where he took on the full power and nature of each form. One of his most fearsome shapes was that of a great werewolf. We're not talking about a normal wolf here. This was a massive, terrifying creature of supernatural power and malice. He commanded an entire pack of werewolves from his fortress of Tol in Garhoth, which literally means Isle of Werewolves. When the elf maiden Luthien and the great hound Huan came to rescue Beren from his dungeons, Sauron took on his wolf form to battle Huan directly. The fight was so fierce that it's described as shaking the very foundations of the fortress. But Huan was no ordinary hound. He was a gift from the Valar themselves, and it had been prophesied that he could only be slain by the greatest wolf that would ever live. When Huan began to prevail over Sauron's wolf form, Sauron desperately transformed again, this time into a great serpent, trying to use his coils to crush or poison his enemy. But Huan's grip remained firm on his throat. Realizing he was about to be defeated, Sauron made one final transformation into a vampire. Tolkien describes him as a vampire, shape of horror, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees. This form allowed him to escape Huan's grasp and flee his own fortress in humiliation, reduced to a creature of the night. These weren't just aesthetic changes. Each form gave him different powers and abilities suited to different purposes. The wolf for savage combat, the serpent for constriction and venom, the vampire for terror and escape. He was, in many ways, the ultimate predator, able to adapt his very nature to whatever his enemies could throw at him. The most dangerous form, Anatar, the beautiful deceiver. But Sauron's most dangerous form wasn't any monster. It was when he appeared as something fair and beautiful. This is the aspect that makes him truly terrifying, because it shows that his greatest weapon wasn't raw power, but deception. After Morgoth's defeat at the end of the First Age, Sauron even took a fair form to appeal to Ernwe, the herald of the Valar, seeking forgiveness. He appeared humble and repentant, but ultimately his pride prevented him from actually going to the Valar for judgment, and he fled into hiding instead. This shows he could have been redeemed, but chose not to be. The most significant use of his fair form came in the Second Age, roughly 3,500 years before the events of the Lord of the Rings. Sauron wanted to control the free peoples of Middle-earth, but he knew he'd never accomplish this through force alone, especially not with the elves, who were wise, powerful, and deeply suspicious of Morgoth's former servants. So Sauron crafted his most elaborate disguise. He took on an appearance so fair that he outshone even the elves themselves. Tall, beautiful, commanding, and radiating wisdom and benevolence. He called himself Anatar, which means Lord of Gifts in Quenya Elvish. He claimed to be an emissary of the Valar, essentially an angel sent from the gods themselves to help the peoples of Middle-earth reach their full potential. Think about how audacious this was. Sauron, who had served Morgoth, the rebel against the Valar and the greatest evil in all creation, was now pretending to be a messenger from those same Valar he had once helped oppose. It would be like Satan showing up claiming to be an archangel sent by God to help humanity. The sheer boldness of the deception is staggering, and it worked, at least partially. Not everyone was fooled. Galadriel had a special gift of perception and saw through his disguise immediately, though she couldn't prove what he was. Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves, also refused to let him into the kingdom of Lindon. Elrond similarly rejected him. But in the elven realm of Eregion, Celebrimbor, the greatest craftsman among the elves and grandson of Feanor himself, was seduced by the promise of knowledge. For years, Anatar lived among the elves as a teacher and friend. He taught them advanced metallurgy, new forms of magic, and the craft of ring-making. To anyone watching, he seemed genuinely benevolent, sharing knowledge freely and helping the elves create works of beauty and power. Together with Celebrimbor and the elven smiths, he helped forge the Rings of Power, 7 for the Dwarf Lords and 9 for men. But here's the insidious brilliance of his deception. Anatar only taught the elves what aided his ultimate plan. He gave them knowledge of how to make rings powerful enough to be worth controlling. but he never taught them how to make rings he couldn't dominate. Every piece of lore he shared, every technique he demonstrated, was carefully calibrated to create artifacts that would be susceptible to the One Ring's power. The knowledge itself was a trap, and the elves' own pride and desire for preservation made them willing prisoners of it. The elves didn't know that every bit of knowledge Anatar shared was part of a larger plan. What Celebrimbor didn't know was that in secret, Sauron had returned to Mordor and forged the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom, a master ring designed to control all the others. The inscription that would eventually appear on it, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them," wasn't poetry. It was its literal function. The moment Sauron first put on the One Ring, every elf who wore one of the other rings immediately felt his presence and perceived his treachery. The deception was revealed in an instant. Celebrimbor realized with horror that he had been manipulated, that his proudest achievement had been corrupted from its inception. He quickly hid the 3 elven rings before Sauron could claim them. Enraged at being discovered and denied his prize, Sauron dropped his fair disguise and declared war on the elves. He laid waste to Eregion, captured Celebrimbor, and tortured him to death, trying to learn where the 3 elven rings were hidden. The Lord of Gifts had become the Lord of Destruction. The final deception, Numenor. But Sauron's shapeshifting didn't end there. Later in the Second Age, when the great island kingdom of Numenor sent an army to challenge him, Sauron saw an opportunity for his greatest deception yet. He allowed himself to be captured and brought back to Numenor as a prisoner. When he arrived on the island, the Numenorians saw him in a form described as a man, or one in man's shape, but greater than any even of the race of Numenor in stature. He appeared imposing, powerful, and according to some accounts, his eyes inspired both fear and a strange fascination. To many, he appeared fair, to others terrible, but to some evil. Over years of patient manipulation, Sauron corrupted the king and the people from within. He convinced them to worship Morgoth, to make human sacrifices, and ultimately to assault the Undying Lands themselves in a mad quest for immortality. This led to the destruction of Numenor, the greatest kingdom of men that ever existed, when the Valar called upon Eru Ilúvatar himself to intervene. The entire island was swallowed by the sea in a single cataclysmic event that changed the very shape of the world. The loss of Fairform. It was in this catastrophe that Sauron's body was destroyed. His spirit survived because he had bound so much of his essence into the One Ring, but when he reformed, something fundamental had changed. He could never again take a fair form. This wasn't just because of the physical destruction of his body, it was because of a deeper metaphysical truth in Tolkien's world. As evil beings invest themselves deeper in domination and tyranny, they lose the ability to appear as anything but what they truly are. The more power Sauron poured into controlling others, the more his outward form became locked into reflecting his inner corruption. Every act of deception, every soul enslaved, every choice toward domination made it harder for him to mask his true nature. By the fall of Numenor, he had gone too far. The shapeshifter had become trapped by his own evil. This is why in the Third Age, during the time of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Sauron appears as the Necromancer, a dark, shadowy presence rather than walking among his enemies in disguise. He had permanently lost the ability to deceive through appearance. His shape-shifting days were over, and he was locked into a form that reflected the evil he had become. Tolkien describes his Third Age form as more than human stature, but not gigantic, and as an image of malice and hatred made visible. He radiated such intense heat that Gil-galad was burned to death by his touch, and his hand was described as black, yet burning like fire. The tragedy, or perhaps the justice, of Sauron's story is visible in this progression. He began as a being capable of taking any form, able to appear as anything from a monster to an angel. But with each act of deception and each choice toward evil, his options narrowed. By the end, he could only appear as what he truly was, hatred and malice given shape. The master shapeshifter had become trapped in the form of his own nature. Number 5. Sauron was obsessed with order and perfection. He wasn't just evil for evil's sake. This is perhaps the most nuanced aspect of Sauron that the films completely miss. When we see him in the movies, he's presented as pure evil, a force of darkness that wants to cover the world in shadow just because he's the bad guy. But Tolkien's conception of Sauron was far more complex, and in some ways, more terrifying because of it. Sauron's original nature was not evil. Remember, he began as Myron, the Admirable, and his defining characteristic was his love of order, efficiency, and perfection. He despised waste, chaos, and anything that was messy or imperfect. In many ways, these might sound like positive traits. Who doesn't like things to be organized and efficient? But this is precisely what made him susceptible to Morgoth's influence. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, promised him the power to impose perfect order on all of Middle-earth, to eliminate all waste and inefficiency, to coordinate everything according to a single, supreme will. To Myron, who had these inclinations from the beginning, this seemed not just attractive, but almost like a moral imperative. Why should the world be chaotic and disordered when it could be perfected? This is why Tolkien wrote that Sauron began with good intentions, but was corrupted by power. His descent into evil wasn't because he wanted to destroy or hurt people for its own sake. It was because he became obsessed with controlling and ordering everything. Every being would have their place. Every action would serve the greater design. All would move in harmony according to his will. It's the ultimate tyranny disguised as ultimate order. The One Ring itself is the perfect expression of this philosophy. It was created specifically to dominate and control all the other rings of power and their bearers. Through it, Sauron could impose his will on anyone who wore one of the other rings, bringing them completely under his command. The Nazgul, the Nine-Ring Wraiths, are the ultimate example of this. Powerful kings of men who were completely enslaved, their individual wills entirely subsumed into Sauron's own. In his letters, Tolkien explicitly stated that while he didn't believe in absolute evil, Sauron came as near an approach to the wholly evil will as is possible. He also noted that Sauron was different from human tyrants, only in that he was an immortal spirit, which meant his pride and lust for domination could grow beyond human limits. This makes Sauron far more interesting, and more relevant, than if he were just a mindless force of destruction. He represents the danger of seeking perfect control, of believing that you alone know how everything should be ordered, and that the ends justify any means. He's what happens when someone with power becomes convinced that imposing their vision of perfect order is worth any price, including the subjugation and suffering of everyone else. The tragedy is that buried deep within Sauron might have been the memory of Myron, the craftsman who genuinely loved beauty and order. But that being was so completely corrupted by his alliance with Morgoth and his own pride that by the Third Age there was nothing redeemable left. He had become his own worst nightmare. Not chaos, but a cold, terrible order, in which every living thing would be nothing more than a tool to serve his will. This is why Tolkien described the ultimate fate of Sauron, after the ring's destruction, as being reduced to a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows. He couldn't be killed, being an immortal spirit, but he would never be able to take form or exert power again. The being who was obsessed with controlling and ordering everything was left able to control nothing, not even himself. He became trapped in a formless existence, forever aware of what he had lost, forever consumed by impotent rage and malice, unable even to manifest in the physical world. The shapeshifter who once could become anything was reduced to nothing. The dominator who sought to control all wills became a powerless shadow. The craftsman who helped create the greatest works of the Second Age ended as something that could create nothing. It's the ultimate irony. In his quest for absolute control and perfect order, Sauron achieved only his own complete powerlessness and eternal disorder. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive tonight. If you enjoyed learning these hidden truths about the Dark Lord, consider sharing this video with fellow Tolkien fans who might only know the movies. There's so much richness in the original text that never made it to the screen. Until next time, stay safe and stay by the fire.